Why I hate it?
Because it's cold and warm?
Because it's cold. Yeah, it's not warm at all. It's cold. I grew up, at least part of my childhood, in Miami. I got used to decent weather. And once it gets down, that first night when it gets down to the 30s at night, it's like a sign of the awful things to come. So this is the time of year when you especially want to, like, I mean, because like me being happy is like in your interest, especially when I start grading, but even now. So whatever collective energy you can put towards warming things up, even with your own energy in terms of class participation, will make me happy. Because winter and everything that leads to winter is bad. The one thing you do not want to do is argue with me about this. So don't come to my office and tell me, no, Professor Markson, you've got to really learn to love the change of seasons. Change of seasons is overrated. And don't come to me telling me how much you love the cold, how it's, it's more invigorating, and hot is, drains you. Don't argue with me about this. There are some things that are just objective truths. Or the reasonable person would not agree with you if you like winter, right? We're going to do this reasonable person stuff today. So this is just one of those things when it's just tough, but we'll get through it together. Okay, that's what's on my mind, the cold. What's on yours before we begin, if anything? That was,
no question. So if we put enough dollars in the box for you downstairs, do you have a plan for a Halloween costume this year?
Well, I would much rather you put dollars in the other professors' buckets.
Oh, I mean the other people that are putting them in there.
Yeah, those unnamed other people. Well, last year, when I unfortunately lost, you might say won, but I say lost, I had two costumes. I did one for my criminal law class and one for my common law class. And for my criminal law class, I came as Justice Ginsburg. And for my common law class, I came as Gandalf. But I actually do have something else in mind if I prevail. But I'm not going to give away what it is because I want the surprise. But I do have something in mind. Every year until last year, I made it my business to make sure I would not win by putting enough money in somebody else's. So it served the overall purpose, which was to raise as much money as possible. But I felt like last year, well, the hell with it. A, it's getting too expensive. And B, let's just see what happens. Just let it ride. And unfortunately, that strategy failed miserably. So we'll see what happens. If it's close, I'll probably go ahead and put money in somebody else's bucket so I don't win. But last year I did two. I'm not sure I'll do two this year if I do prevail. And so maybe I did the common law class instead of this class. Well, I don't know. I'll maybe do this class because last year's common law people, at least most of them, already saw me in costume because they had me for criminal law. Not all, but most. So maybe I'll do this class, but no promises. No promises. Last year was you got a twofer. That's a bargain. Okay. All right. Let's talk about Walker. We're into now provocation, whether you call it under its common law terminology of heat of passion, or its modern terminology, EED, extreme emotional disturbance. Provocation. The idea is that something happened. You saw something, you experienced something triggered you to lose control. As a result, you killed or attempted to kill somebody, and you're being charged depending on the particular state and the way it uses the name of the crime. Could be voluntary manslaughter, could be manslaughter first degree. Whatever the terminology is, it's some kind of manslaughter. And it's not murder because of the provocation. So let's start with Walker. What did McClinton, who was our chief witness for the prosecution, what did McClinton say happened here that gave rise to our prosecution of Walker?
He said that they were on the porch together.
And they
With
meaning
Walker.
this group of 4 people, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
McClinton, Walker, and others. And so the victim came up and
Stenneth, right, is the victim.
yes, and he demanded that they gamble. Which is
Because why not?
interesting,
Right? It's like, some person walks up to you and says, you know what? I think it's time for us to play some dice or poker or bet on the ponies or it's time to gamble and you're gonna gamble with me. And how did they respond?
And so they refused, and so then
And
he
if
produced-
Mr. Williams, if I walked up to you and said, I want us to gamble right now, right? And you said no, not interested, right? I don't want to be gambling, I don't want no debts or get on the bad side of my professor, that would be a bad thing. But you say no, how would you expect me to react?
I would assume you would go find someone else to gamble with.
Or just give up the whole idea of gambling, but I would leave it at that. I would take no for an answer. Did Stenneth take no for an answer?
No.
What did he do?
He pulled out a knife.
He pulled out a knife. He pulled out a knife because he really wanted to gamble, right? And he's not happy being turned down. So what happens next?
And so then at first, McClinton advances at him, and but so then the
McClinton was that a smart thing to do? You advance on somebody who holds a knife?
no, he grabbed a couple of bottles.
Right, because when you're playing poker, 2 bottles beats a knife, right?
I guess.
All right. And he tells Stenneth, I'm going to hit him if you come up on me with that knife. So at this point, McClinton seems our most likely candidate to be doing bad things to Stenneth, because he's the one who's responding with anger, with getting himself armed, but no, things develop in another direction. What happens next?
So there's some back and forth where it looks like the deceased individual keeps running up, and it looks like he's going to cut them.
And Walker at one point seems to be the peacemaker, right? He says to McClinton, and Jenkins also does this, he says, come back on the porch, let's not have any ugliness, let's not make a scene. And McClinton is the one who's like, forget it, he will not be calmed down. He's like, every time this guy turns up, he tries to cut me, I'm not going to have this anymore. So Walker and Jenkins manage to back Stenneth down, but Stenneth is still cutting at them, right?
Right.
What does McClinton say he saw?
Well, so then Walker picks up a brick, and he throws it, and it hits Stenneth, and so it knocks him down. And so then they run up around him, and at that point, Walker picks up Stenneth's hand with the knife, and he stabs him with it. And
he tells him, he says, I'm going to cut your throat with your own knife.
Right.
So at least he's a man of his word. Right? At least he's a man of his word. And Walker does it and walks away. And McClinton says, well, you shouldn't have cut the man. You shouldn't have done that. And Walker says, you told me not to cut the man. He cut me. Not sure what that's all about, but that's what happens. So what happens at trial?
Well, so at trial, he gets convicted of murder.
Convicted of murder. And he's not happy about this.
Right.
Right? Even though he just slashed a man's throat. Right? He thinks, no, it should have been murder. What does he say it should have been?
Manslaughter.
And why? What's the basis for him arguing it should have been manslaughter?
Just because it was a provoked act during the fight, that there was an irresistible passion that was kind of brought about by the fight.
That didn't work. We're just going to abandon red today and try good old-fashioned black. So if a killing, much better, occurs during a fight, and we're going to put that in brackets because that's going to stand in for something more broad. This is just used as an example. occurs during a fight and before the blood has time to cool. I love that. Phraseology. It's so much more vivid than what we use today. Before the blood has time to cool, then what should be the result? As you said, Mr. Williams?
Manslaughter.
Should be voluntary manslaughter. Now, it doesn't have to be just a fight. It can be anything that constitutes a sufficient provocation. The fight just happens to be the thing that he argues constitutes the provocation here, okay? So what makes for voluntary manslaughter? What is going to be our test? What elements have to be present that we're then going to apply to this case? What elements does the court list as being voluntary manslaughter, as constituting voluntary manslaughter?
It has to be a voluntary act.
Well, sure. Otherwise, they're not even going to be. If you don't have a voluntary act, then you don't have. The act is raised in the first place. Wrong.
Unpremeditated.
I'm sorry.
Unpremeditated.
Not just unpremeditated. Yes.
Without malice, without mixture of deliberation.
That's what it doesn't have. What does it have?
It says there has to be a serious and highly provoking injury.
I'm sorry?
A serious and highly provoking injury or an intent by the person killed to commit that serious injury. And
What does that provoke?
that
What
pro-
does you're talking about provoke?
that provokes the irresistible passion in a reasonable person.
So we have we'll talk about reasonable person in a minute. A sudden heat of passion. Right? Sudden is going to reappear. A sudden heat of passion, sufficient. What does it have to be? How high does that have to be? How provoking does that have to be?
It has to be irresistible.
Sufficient to make the passion irresistible. Okay. What else, Ms. Clements?
And it says that there can't be an interval in between the assault, the provocation given, and the killing. Otherwise, it would be attributed to deliberate revenge, which would be murder.
No cooling off period. Right? Because if the blood has time to cool, it should have cooled. Okay? So it has to be sufficient to make the passion irresistible. To whom? To a reasonable person. I told you we were going to talk about a reasonable person today. I'm going to put it in caps. Who decides whether the provoking incident was of sufficient provocation, was sufficiently intense, that a reasonable person would have snapped? The jury. This is going to be a quintessential jury question. The defense is going to, the prosecution is going to say, let's say the issue is raised, there's a claim of provocation, the prosecution is going to say, no reasonable person would have responded to that by losing control. The defense is going to say that was very, very disturbing, that a reasonable person would not be able to resist the loss of control. Okay? And then the jury's going to have to decide, bringing all their experience, bringing all their points of view, with what they have seen in the real world, and make a determination. And that determination is going to be the difference between a murder conviction and a manslaughter conviction. Very significant, obviously, to your client if you are the defense lawyer, and of course also if you're the prosecution. Okay? So it's an irresistible passion attributable to a provocation, sufficient to inflame a reasonable person with no cooling off period. That is your definition. Let me give that again. An irresistible passion attributable to a provocation, sufficient to inflame a reasonable person with no cooling off period between the time of the provocation and the reaction. Okay? Everyone get that from the case? If you didn't get that from the case and the subsequent cases, then come see me. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about where you can find that in the case, etc. Okay? Now, what do we have to know now? What's the next part? Now we've got our definition. What's the next question, Mr. Williams?
The next question after.
Well, now we know our standard. We
Right,
know
maybe what the reasoning that the court used.
What do you mean by the reasoning the court used?
Oh, I was just trying to guess where.
What's the next thing? What's the next thing we have to know now that we have our standard? Now that we have our test for voluntary manslaughter. What's
how
left?
the jury applied it?
I'm sorry?
How the jury applied it?
How the jury applied it? We care about how the jury applied it, but we're going to decide, did the jury get it right? Right? Was it voluntary manslaughter or was it not voluntary manslaughter? What does the court say? Outcome is what I'm getting at.
Well, sure, yeah. The court says, because the original one was murder, that it was not, that wasn't appropriate. So
Why? Why does the
part
court
of their
say this
reasoning
was in fact voluntary manslaughter?
because they almost say the deceased kind of had it coming to him, and they mentioned he was aggressive, intoxicated.
So what is that part of our definition?
And belligerent. I guess that's
In terms of our
what
elements,
set the irresistible, the sudden heat of passion from the fight.
What
Because
does Steneth represent in this definition?
the provocation.
The provocation, right? Steneth is the provocation, attributatory provocation. And he was aggressive, intoxicated, belligerent, who menaced all these people who were on the porch just minding their own business on a Chicago evening, right? He was swinging his knife at everyone, and the point, Walker apparently was cut, and that represented the provocation. If you were arguing for the prosecution on this appeal, what would you say about that? It's called?
Based on testimony, his blood was never boiled. He wasn't.
A little more specific.
I would say that there was a cooling off period. I mean, actually, the guy was with a brick.
More specific. I mean, those are good answers, but I wanted something a little more specific.
That the aggressive group portrayed the reasonable person standard and that they did not.
I like that. But again, not what I'm getting at, but all good answers. What have we talked about in terms of how appellate courts look at jury verdicts, or how they're supposed to look at jury verdicts?
The juries where they tried to not change the jury verdict because that's 12 people.
That's a little abstract. They try not to change the jury verdict. Give it to me more in terms of the legal test for reviewing jury verdicts.
They look at the jury verdict most favorably to the prosecution.
Look at the evidence in the light most favorable to the verdict, in this case guilty of murder, and they look at all evidence in that light, and if any reasonable jury could come to the conclusion it did, then you leave the jury verdict undisturbed. Okay? What would you say? Where could you say that the appellate court maybe didn't do that here? What point do they make about why Walker was provoked that is maybe a little shaky, if not more than a little shaky? What do they say was one of the parts of him being, why he was so provoked and why it was so provocative that a reasonable person would lose control? I want you to think like a prosecutor here. Think like a prosecutor dealing with this evidence.
Is it that Steneth was unconscious?
Steneth was unconscious, but that's not whether he was provoked to. What does the court say, Ms. Cull, about hitting him with the brick and the timing of that and the sequence?
Well, I was just gonna say that the injury wasn't serious to the defendant, like not as serious.
But that's an alternative. It doesn't have to be an injury, right? It can just be some other provocation. They don't say that's the only kind of injury.
I was going to say that it was continuous.
Prosecution's certainly going to argue that. The court says here, he was cut. And then he hit him with the brick. Is the evidence clear on that, Mr. Williams? Didn't McClinton say he didn't see him cut?
Right. We don't necessarily know if he was cut or not.
And couldn't the jury have concluded he never was cut? If we're looking at the evidence in the light most favorable to the prosecution? Notice those details, right? Those details are the way you build an argument. If you're defending this jury verdict as the prosecutor in your brief, one of the things you're going to say is, he was never injured. The jury could have concluded that he was never actually injured and simply acted in a way that no reasonable person would have. So those little factual details from which you can build your case. It may be he was. I'm not saying he wasn't, but could the jury have concluded otherwise? I think you can make that argument. Okay? Everyone see that? All right. The court says it was all part of one continuous affray, as the court puts it, and he never had a chance to cool down. Everything happened fast, McClinton said. It all happened pretty fast, right? Again, could the jury have concluded not fast enough, that a reasonable person would have cooled down? My own view is, this is a verdict that probably should have stood. When you build in the deference that's supposed to go to a jury verdict, but you can see the elements the appellate court is taking into account on the legal side. Was it sudden? Was he provoked? Was there a cooling off period? No, it was therefore voluntary manslaughter. All right, I want to ask two questions about this. Even if we assume that there was no cooling off period, was the initial provocation of the sort that a reasonable person would have lost control? What do you think?
I mean, you could say no, like, based off of, what she said, like, with the other people around the table, like, they didn't necessarily react the same way as, Walker.
And if you were arguing for the defense, what would your response to that very, very good point be?
I mean, different people have different temperaments, maybe.
But it's the reasonable person standard, but there's a piece of the factual puzzle that at least lets the defense argue in the other way.
That he was being attacked personally, and the other guys were just fighting off it.
Yeah, maybe, but no.
They didn't have to do anything because Walker
Did
didn't.
anyone? Was Walker the only one who responded?
No,
McClinton was too. Right? It's not like no one responded in a way that was angry and inclined towards violence towards Stenneth. McClinton, who's our witness. Now, he didn't end up killing him, but he armed himself. He advanced at Stenneth with the bottles, and he had to be sort of pulled back from that reaction. Unfortunately for Walker, no one pulled him back. So you could argue that that is the way the defense could argue that a reasonable person would react by losing their cool, because in fact McClinton did. So there's evidence both ways about how, well, some people apparently kept their cool and some people didn't. Here's an important point about this. One of the critiques of heat of passion, or EED, is that the argument is that somehow it implies, the very existence of this doctrine implies that it's reasonable to kill somebody, that reasonable people respond to provocation by killing. And the law shouldn't do that. The law shouldn't build into the definitions of crimes the idea that, hey, reasonable people take other lives, that there's always a response. The law's answer to that is, we're not saying it's reasonable to kill. We're saying it's reasonable to lose control. And losing control and acting in a certain way. We're not justifying that. We're not letting you off the hook the way we do with self-defense, for example. But we're just saying you're less culpable than somebody who acts without provocation. So that's the argument. The argument's on both sides of that. Or we shouldn't say it's reasonable to kill, and the answer to those who think this should be in the law is, all we're saying is that reasonable people sometimes lose control. Okay? We also are not saying that that provocation justifies killing. We're saying that provocation justifies mitigating the punishment. Mitigating the punishment. All right, last thing I want to talk about before we move on to Fraley is the burden of proof question discussed on page 386. Who has the burden of proof on EED? Anybody want to guess what the law is in Kentucky on the burden of proof? Mr. Johnson?
Well, it says the defendant may bear the burden of establishing proof or establishing EED or a provocation, I mean. And so
The
in
defendant
Kentucky,
may. Now, and what is
and did you want me to guess Kentucky?
Or enlighten us if you know.
No, I don't, but I guess that it's on the defense.
You guess that it's on the defendant. All right, let's see. How many people think that the burden of proof is on the defendant to prove EED in Kentucky? Mr. Johnson, you just said it is. You're gonna bail like that?
I'm Googling.
Don't Google. I want everyone to take their shot here. Who thinks the burden of proof is on the defendant? There's no cost here to guessing, okay? How many people think the burden is on the state? And how many people are just not going to guess no matter what I do? Some. All right. The model penal code puts the burden on the state. Most states, even if they've adopted the MPC formulation, have not adopted the burden of proof. So in most states, EED is an affirmative defense. The burden is on the defendant to show EED, to prove that they acted under extreme emotional disturbance. Kentucky is in the minority. Because it's always best to bet on the majority because there's more of them, but here we're in the minority. Under 507.020 subsection 1, that's the provision that makes EED an element of murder, the prosecution bears the burden of proof to show the absence of EED. As long as the defendant first comes forward with some evidence that there was a provocation to put it in issue. Right? So the defendant has a burden of production. Some evidence of provocation. They don't bear a burden of proof, just some evidence to put it in issue. To raise the issue. Once the defendant does this, some evidence that there was a provocation, now prosecution or the Commonwealth has burden of proof to establish beyond a reasonable doubt the absence of EED. And they can do that, of course, by showing that a reasonable person would not have responded to that provocation by losing their cool. They can show that there was a cooling off period. Whatever it is they're going to show, the prosecution has the burden of proof to show it, the absence of EED, to show that the standard for EED has not been met under the facts. That's Kentucky law.
What's the KRS?
Well, the KRS is the general provision 507.020 subsection 1, where that's the murder provision that says EED means it's not murder, it's manslaughter. The case that establishes this burden of proof is Benjamin versus Commonwealth. Benjamin versus Commonwealth. And if you're interested in looking at the case, Again, you don't need to, just trust me that it stands for this proposition. But the citation to Benjamin is 266 Southwest 3rd, 775. 266 Southwest 3rd, 775. Benjamin versus Commonwealth. Okay? And that's from 2008. Kentucky Supreme Court, 2008. Okay? Questions about that? How that sequence operates? Okay. Let's talk about Fraley. I hope that when you read this case, you could just picture this scene. It's like out of an old-time Western movie, right? It's in Oklahoma, sort of a bunch of guys sitting around in front of the town's drugstore. It's just after the turn of into the 20th century, so more than 100. I mean, it's like, you could almost envision, at least I could, okay? So what happened between Parker and the defendant, Fraley? Ms. Wall, rather.
So Fraley is walking up and he sees Dan Parker, who is talking in front of a drugstore with some other people about walnut timber. And the petitioner comes around the corner, he sees him, he says hello, and then he
So he is polite.
very polite.
Very polite. Before he does anything else, he says, "Hi, Dan." And then
He shoots him twice.
he shoots him twice in quick succession, okay? Does that kill our friend Fraley?
He stumbles,
Parker.
he stumbles around a bit, and then I think he falls down, and Fraley shoots him again 4 times. And it says in the deceased, so he's dead, I think, when he hits the ground.
But
so he shoots him.
nevertheless, Fraley walks off, says, "You know what? I'm not so sure. I don't want to take any chances." What does he do?
He comes back and he hits him twice with a gun, and then tells him that he told him he was going to kill him because he killed his son.
You killed my son. And there doesn't seem to be much dispute about any of what you just related, because 7 witnesses testified consistently with this picture of the facts, okay? So what gave rise to these actions? We get some hint of it from Fraley's comment, "I told you I'd kill you, you killed my boy." Tell me about that.
So 9 or 10 months before this happened, Parker killed Fraley's son, but he was acquitted on this charge.
But he was acquitted, and we don't really know why he was acquitted, whether it was a problem of the proof that he did or some defense that he had, self-defense, but he was acquitted one way or the other. And what does Fraley argue as a result of these facts?
That there was no premeditation, that he was just overcome when he saw Parker and he shot him, and so that he can't be charged with murder.
And so this, he argues for heat of passion.
Right.
That I was provoked by seeing Parker, and I snapped and I lost control. So does he have a valid provocation / heat of passion defense?
Not according to the Oklahoma Criminal Court of Appeals.
That's a very cautious answer, as if you're afraid that I'm going to think they got it wrong.
No, I don't know. I think that he has a valid heat of passion.
Okay.
If we're going to say that someone threw a brick and then walked over to a person and slit their throat, and then that counts as heat of passion.
What's the difference between the 2 cases?
That there is a 9-month interval between the first thing happening and then this happening.
Would we say in the Walker case that if Stenneth had menaced these guys, trying to force them to gamble, and then 9 months later, Walker said, "Oh my God, it's you again. I remember what you did with that knife," and then he hit him with a brick and cut him with his own knife, would Walker have had a valid defense?
No, but I think this one is a lot different than.
This was a lot. It's not different in that way.
No.
And why is that significant?
Because the whole point is what a reasonable person would do in that
Well, it's
instance,
not
and,
not
like,
just that, but
the fact that
a reasonable person with respect to what aspect of this test?
the heat of passion.
No.
Cooling off.
Lineweaver? The cooling off period. There cannot be a cooling off period. Period. Exclamation point, whichever you like, right? This is the key difference. Right? It is true, it is absolutely true that the provocation here was way higher, killing of the child, versus menacing with a knife, even if he got cut. But there is a hard and fast rule, as certainly as of 1910, a hard and fast rule that if this exists, you do not have a heat of passion defense. And the reason for that is the law argues and says that and it relates to this, that a reasonable person would do what during a cooling off period?
Nothing.
Well, what would happen by definition during a cooling off
You
period?
would cool.
They've cooled off. That a reasonable person would no longer be in such a state that they cannot control themselves. What would have happened if Fraley had immediately killed Parker at the moment the verdict was read and he was acquitted of killing Fraley's son?
I feel like, according to this logic, it would do the same thing, because the
No.
act would be over.
That if, at the moment the verdict had been read, what would Fraley's argument have been?
That he was overcome with passion, that the guy was going to get away with.
And
The provocation was he was going to be found not guilty and acquitted.
if he did it at that very moment, he's reacting spontaneously to the verdict, knowing, oh my God, this guy, this murderer is getting away with killing my son. And he would be able to argue, no cooling off period. Right? What amounts to a cooling off period? Where's the line between a cooling off period? Here we have 9 months, or let's say 9 months. Right? Here we have 9 months. Versus on the other side of the scale, instantaneous. Had Fraley reacted instantaneously, easy case. There is no cooling off period. That by definition, that means it's instantaneous, right? So if there's any situation where that provocation can be enough, it's in the situation where it was instantaneous. On the other side of the scale, 9 months, it's never going to work, period. Okay, I very rarely give you black letter, absolute rules. I'm giving you one now. 9 months, give it up. Ms. or Mr. Defense Attorney, plead your client if you can, because that is not going to get you a heat of passion defense in any state, any jurisdiction that has that rule. So where's the line between instantaneous, yes, that might be provocation, that might be heat of passion, and 9 months, no chance, it's never going to be.
So the court says it's shown by circumstances and gives examples of transactions on the business, rational conversations, preparation.
So that's some evidence of what might show there's been a cooling off period, right? Very good. But what if I said 3 days? Is that a cooling off period enough that it defeats the defense, Mr. Lamb?
The court has said that half a day to a day is generally sufficient.
Is generally sufficient to be a cooling off period. So 3 days would be. But what's that key word in there? Mr. Lamb just used? I'm sorry? Generally. Generally. There is no hard and fast rule. Who decides then, if there's no hard and fast rule, that it's an absolute, that X is a cooling off period and Y is not?
The jury.
The jury. The jury says, would a reasonable person have had time to have their blood cool, to no longer be in that state of provocation, that a reasonable person would have calmed down, may still be angry, may still find this an injustice, but a reasonable person would be able to control themselves. So there's no hard and fast rule. 3 days is probably going to be enough that you should have cooled off. Would I at least, if I'm a defense attorney, be willing to try to make that argument with 3 days? I'm at least take a shot. 9 months, I'm a goner. 9 months is like, right? That's how long it takes to have a baby. You should be able to cool off in that much time, right, Johnson?
Does him saying, I told you I was going to kill you, does that show premeditation at all?
Whose side are you on?
I'm on the prosecution.
Then what are you going to say?
Yes.
You're going to say, you're darn right it does, right? I told you I would kill you. Does that show heat of passion? No, it shows thoughtful deliberation, almost cold-bloodedness. And cold-bloodedness is literally the opposite of hot-bloodedness. That's what I'm going to argue. Okay, Mr. Johnson, because I'm not a nice person, what would you argue about that if you were the defense?
Okay, hold on, let me think.
That's so unfair, I'm sorry. Actually, no, I'm sorry.
I'm not sure.
You got to have something.
That, I don't know.
What are you going to say it might show? What would you...
It might,
Am I going to let off the hook?
You said that, the fact that he said that I told you I was gonna kill you, is that his heat or his blood hadn't cooled yet?
And what would you, ideally, if you could, like, there's one fact you don't know, and we're going to give you a freebie to add a fact. Usually that's my job, I add the facts, but you're going to add the fact. What fact would you like to be true about that statement? Give you carte blanche to add whatever fact you want.
Would it be that right after the victim got acquitted, he told him he would kill him?
Exactly. Excellent. When did he say it? If he said it right after the verdict was rendered and he knew that that Parker was going to get away with it, then you can say, oh, well, the statement itself was part of the heat of passion. Now, we don't know that, but if I'm the defense lawyer, I'm praying that was something he shouted out in court. I'm going to kill you, you SOB. Right? Well, there's evidence. And now he's just repeating it, but he originally said it at the moment to show how angry, how awful this was to him, and how a reasonable father, right? Because you're not going to call Fraley a reasonable person. You're going to call him a reasonable father who had lost his child and now sees that justice has not been done. That's what the defense is going to argue, right? Unsuccessfully. Because the law says, fairly or not, that if you have a cooling off period, it ain't heat of passion, it's murder. It ain't manslaughter, it's murder. Okay? Questions?
In here it
Ms.
says,
Harper.
if there's an unreasonable period of time, then the court decides and not the jury. So is that like...
If there's an unreasonable period of
Yeah,
time?
it says when an unreasonable period of time has elapsed between the provocation and the killing, then the court is authorized to say as a matter of law that the cooling time was sufficient.
Right.
So does that mean like when you hit the 9 months, they're never going to put that to a jury?
Right,
The court's
there's
just
some
gonna say-
point as you're going along this continuum where the judge will say, I'm not even putting that issue to the jury. That there is, as a matter of law, sufficient time to cool off, that a reasonable person would have regained control even if they might have lost it earlier, and the jury doesn't even get instructed to consider voluntary manslaughter, or in the case of Kentucky, first-degree manslaughter. Okay, Ms. Harper.
So, based on how the court ruled in this case back then in 1910, and thinking about different changes that have happened in laws leading up to the present day, do you think the defense would have had any stronger case in modern times?
I think they would have had, except in one place, which we'll see in a minute, they had a less of a chance. There's been no real change in most places in enforcing, in a pretty strict way, the rule of the cooling off period. It's like, and there's a pretty good argument, and there's a lot of literature out there critiquing the EED, development of voluntary EED, that talks about that we have expanded what counts as enough of a provocation to expand voluntary manslaughter or first-degree manslaughter, but no real critique or no real observation that we've expanded the cooling off period, as I say, except in one place, and that's the California case we're going to do. Let's see, not next, but next to next, after Rowland in Berry. In Berry, we get some relaxing of the rule that there cannot be a cooling off period, but that is a very unique to California phenomenon. Okay? All right, let's talk about Rowland. Who did Rowland kill? Ms. Rivera.
Wife?
His wife, and that is Becky, right? And what had been going on between them?
So the wife lived apart from the husband at her friend's house.
That's Ms. Pate.
Ms.
Ms.
Pate.
But there was still some connection between them.
They saw each other every so often. He'd come visit. And on this particular day that he came to visit,
Before you do that, give me the layout of the Pate's house, because it's going to end up being relevant here.
when you come in, the entrance led you through the Pate's bedroom, and then on to
And in that room, there were 2 beds,
right.
right? That was the front room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Lou Pate and her husband slept.
Yes.
And then there was the back room, and that's where Becky slept. And there was 1 bed back there.
Not just Becky.
Okay, good. So what happened on the night of the killing? What was that, Mr.
I
Johnson?
said not just Becky slept back there. I'm just teasing. I'm just teasing.
Well, if we're gonna get detailed about it, no one was apparently sleeping.
Oh.
So what happened on the night of the killing?
He showed up at around 10 o'clock, and he saw John Thorne's horse.
Horse, you say? A horse is a horse, of course. Of course. Horse. He saw John Thorne's horse, that's very hard to say, hitched to a fence, okay? And it's usually true, not invariably, but usually true that where a man's horse is, so is he likely to be, right? And so it was on this night at the Pate's house. What does our friend Roland hear?
He hears John Thorne say, "Make haste," and he realizes that Becky and John are in Becky's room. So
And he tries to open the back door, but it was latched, because Thorne and Becky were no fools, right? They locked the door. So he goes around to the front, pushes it open, goes into the front room. Obviously, the Pates are startled by this. It's like, excuse me, we have a home invasion here. They're asleep. Roland speaks to them. He calls Becky's name. He gets no answer. He goes into the back room and
he sees them in the very act of committing adultery. And so they are surprised to see him, and they spring up, and they are both trying to get out past him. And on her way out, Becky blows out the lamp, and then Roland fires at Thorne, and instead of hitting Thorne, kills his wife.
because it's dark,
Right.
right? The lamp has been blown out. He fires at Thorne, and he kills instead Becky. Okay, Lou Pate confirms most of this story, which was primarily based, what you just related, was on Roland's testimony, and it says basically the same thing, at least so far as she was aware of the facts, what she looked up. And what does the trial court tell the jury in its instructions?
They instruct the jury that murder is killing a human being without authority of the law by any means or in any manner when done with a deliberate design to effect the death of the person killed. And if the jury believed from the evidence in this case beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant so killed the deceased Becky Roland, then the jury will find the defendant guilty as charged in the bill of indictment.
And what did the court tell the jury about manslaughter and heat of passion? Because here's what you have to find to convict Roland of murder, as charged in the indictment, as you said. If he killed with deliberate effect, the act was done with deliberate effect to effect the death of the person killed or another, etc. So that's the jury being told about murder. What was the jury told about manslaughter?
That it was necessary that the defendant found them in the very act of adultery.
Is that what the trial court told the jury? What did the trial court tell the jury, Ms. Clemens?
The trial court didn't tell the jury.
Tell the jury did not instruct the jury about whether it could find or what was required to find heat of passion. So the jury was not given the instruction at all. It was not given that option to choose between murder and manslaughter. Okay? Was that a good idea, Mr. Vera? Why not?
Because he appeals.
I'm sorry?
He appeals that.
Well, yes, he appealed that, but it wouldn't matter from the prosecution's point of view if he appeals that if it was correct. Was it correct not to give the instruction?
No.
It was a mistake. Why was it a mistake?
Because of the rule that said that that if he had caught, there was a different case that said that if he had caught his wife in the act of adultery, then the crime would have been extenuated to manslaughter.
And if you are a trial judge, what is your reason for not giving an instruction? Let's assume the defense asks for a manslaughter instruction. What would be your thinking? Obviously, it's going to be wrong thinking, but what would be your, in general terms, what would be your thinking about why, no, I'm not going to give that instruction here? Think about this situation in Kentucky, for example. The defendant has the burden of producing some evidence of provocation, and then the prosecution has the burden of proof to establish the absence of provocation or EED. So why might you, as a trial judge, in a case where this is the construct, where this is the framework, why might you refuse to give an instruction even though the defense asked for it?
Could it be that there wasn't enough burden, there hadn't been enough production of proof by the
So
defense?
your answer, trial judge, is like, yeah, the defense is asking for this, but I'm not going to give it because the defense hasn't put it in issue. There is no evidence here, the trial judge is thinking, of the kind of behavior, the kind of provocation that constitutes that can trigger heat of passion. So that's probably why the trial judge says, nope, not going to give it. This is either murder or nothing. And he was convicted of murder. And that's wrong because the trial court says finding your wife in the act of adultery is kind of the very heart, the paradigm case of heat of passion. And the jury should have been thus able to consider whether discovering Becky in this state of affairs with Thorne did in fact constitute the kind of provocation for which or under which a reasonable person would lose control. Now the court then says that one of the reasons we have this rule is because a provocation means that it obviates the deliberation necessary for murder, i.e. it sort of cuts off the possibility that there was premeditation. That's one of the reasons the court gives, which leads me to this question. Kentucky doesn't have premeditation. Lots of states nowadays don't have premeditation. So if the reason for heat of passion is that it means there was no premeditation, which is required for murder, and now we've eliminated premeditation, should we also eliminate heat of passion? Right? Because heat of passion cuts off the premeditation, but now premeditation is not required. Why shouldn't it be murder?
Is that what they would call temporary insanity?
No. It's a great question. I'm going to try to answer it as quickly as I can because we're behind. But the short answer to that is don't mix up insanity, temporary or not, with heat of passion. The difference between them is provocation. Insanity of whichever variety is an internal mental state. It's not provoked by anything. It's part of a psychological condition that you have, and presumably some expert will testify to. It is not an external provocation that causes it, and that's the difference in a nutshell. In a nutshell, but it's not temporary insanity. If you in a non-premeditation environment, how would you still argue for provocation / heat of passion / EED as a valid part of the law?
Would it have to do with the mens rea requirement?
How so?
The murder or capital offense would have to establish the mens rea of intent, and manslaughter does not. So
Well, the act is still intentional. I don't know if I go there. It's triggered by something. Something triggers your intent. But what would be your, let's say you're in the legislature and somebody puts forward a bill to say we're going to eliminate the difference between EED, i.e. manslaughter, and intentional murder. Because since we don't have premeditation anymore, EED can't cut off the premeditation, or is not a justification to show there was no premeditation. If you wanted to oppose the bill, why would you oppose the bill?
So the law still should recognize that it's reasonable to lose control under given
Good.
circumstances.
Good, right? The premeditation argument is one argument. It's not the only argument. Always keep in mind that there are alternative arguments. And here, the argument is still, even absent premeditation, there is a difference in the culpability of someone who is provoked versus someone who is not provoked, right? Neither one of them premeditates, let's assume, because premeditation isn't required. But one person was provoked and one person formed the intent to kill instantaneously, but without provocation. The argument would be we should still keep this distinction because the provoked person who lost control is not as culpable. That would be the argument. Okay? Last thing I want to note about this case is that while there are certainly some suggestions in some of the case law going way back that this was all about male honor and that men are men because they don't allow somebody to cheat with their wives, and therefore there's some sexism built into this, that nowadays it goes both ways. So if you are a wife who catches your husband in the act of adultery, you have just as much of a right to claim EED. Now, whether a jury would find it as reasonable that you lose control, or whether there would be a double standard in that, because women are supposed to be less prone to flying off the handle, less prone to anger, that's a whole other question. As it is actually applied, there could definitely be a difference, and women do not get the benefit of this as much in terms of having their charges, having their convictions be only manslaughter rather than murder. But the law on its face, at least, works equally for a spurned wife as it does for a spurned husband. I am not aware of any law or any literature that would speak to the issue when it comes to same-sex couples. That's a whole other question. Okay? Questions about this whole area of adultery as it relates to EED or heat of passion? Yeah.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding one of the notes correctly.
Okay.
So if he had thought that they were committing adultery and killed him, but he was wrong and they weren't committing adultery, then I think what it's saying is if he was reasonable in that belief, then he would still have that defense.
I think you can find cases that go in two different directions. One is exactly what you just described, right? That his belief that it was adultery had to be reasonable. There are other cases that would say that even if his belief was unreasonable, just because he had it, and then a reasonable person would have responded to that belief, that would be enough. I think that most cases would go the way you just described, that it has to be a reasonable belief and that a reasonable person would lose control in response to that reasonable belief, right, when you're wrong. The other set of cases that are mentioned in one of the notes is cases in which you don't actually observe firsthand the adultery. You just are told about it, right? You're at a bar, you're at a meeting, you run into a friend on the street, and they say, man, I just saw your wife with so-and-so. Is that enough, or do you have to observe it? And that raises the more general question, can words be provocation? Because those are words. You're not actually observing it. And the words happen to be about adultery. And I'm going to leave for the moment the question of whether words can be sufficient, because I'm going to get to that later when we talk about specifics of Kentucky EED law. Okay? Yeah.
What if he went over to the house already suspecting that there was an affair going on, and like, does there have to be a cooling off period
think decides a question like that? The jury, right? The the prosecution's gonna say, because he had the suspicion, he would not have been provoked because it was just confirmed. That is, the anger, the provocation was when he arose when he became suspicious. Whatever the reason was for that suspicion, he found a text message, right? Or his wife wasn't home when she said she was going to be home, or there's been a pattern of behavior that is sort of gradually raised, whatever it is, it's gradually raised suspicion. That's when he would lose control, but he's had time while going where he now thinks things might be going on to calm down. Defense is going to say, no, suspicion is not the same. A reasonable person is not provoked by mere suspicion, and you shouldn't punish my client because he was reasonable in keeping his composure, being under control, until he found out. And when he found out, things snapped. So you don't want to punish him for his earlier reasonableness by now saying he doesn't have a defense once he did lose control. Argue it both ways. Jury says, would a reasonable person, given all the facts, the suspicion, whatever actions he took on the suspicion, however long it took to confirm, what he saw when he confirmed, all blah, 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 the jury decides would a reasonable person have lost control, and how does that play out? Yeah.
Sorry for this last question. I don't mean to hold this up, but so he killed his wife. He could have killed him and probably get the same result. Yeah. So if he killed him, he'd probably get the same result.
Oh, yeah.
What if he killed everyone in the house just because they all let it happen? I mean, do you think he would still get the ED? Like, okay, so I'm killing.
All right, here's a general rule for you. All right, remember I said I don't give you like absolutes? I'm going to give you a quasi-absolute. Serial killers don't get EED. Okay, if he killed the Pates,
yeah,
right, killed their cat,
yeah.
Whatever, whoever was in the house. Almost certainly, right? Because that would not be a reasonable response, right? But he certainly at least has a shot when he only kills. Now, if he killed both of them, Thorne and his wife, different answer.
Okay.
But if he goes after the Pates, he's got a problem. He's got a bigger problem than manslaughter. All right. Now, I mentioned to you that this California case, Berry, is sort of an outlier. And I want you to think of it as an outlier, but it's here to sort of provoke your thinking about stretching the definition and the application of manslaughter. So this is a candidate, I'm not going to say it wins, but it's a candidate for the worst marriage of all time. Albert Berry and Rachel Pesach. So somebody tell me about their marriage. Clemens, tell me about their marriage.
So they were married, I'm assuming some kind of arranged marriage. He's 46, she's 20. They're from Israel. And then 3 days after they were married,
This is in May of '74. Yeah.
So 3 days later, Rachel went to Israel by herself.
Not a good sign right there, I'm going to say.
And then looks like about a couple of weeks later, she returned.
Well, a couple of months later. She comes back in July.
Yeah, sorry, a couple of months, July. Yeah. She returned and had some interesting things to tell her husband.
What did she have to say to Mr. Berry?
So she said she had a relationship with another man. And
Yaakov.
And was in love with him. She wanted a divorce. And she sort of tormented him with this information for a couple of weeks.
And their relationship is at best tumultuous during this time. She goes back and forth between saying she wants to stay married to him. Apparently there's, at least according to Berry's testimony, there are times when they are affectionate, and then times when she is cruel. And we'll talk about what their expert, who's himself a piece of work, says about her behavior, her alleged behavior. But it's at best quite inconsistent. It varies from day to day. So how does he respond about 10 days after she gets back to what is her behavior towards him?
Well, he ended up choking her into unconsciousness.
This is like the day before he ends up killing her, right? First he chokes her, and she reports this to the San Francisco police, who issue a warrant for his arrest. Okay? So then what happens?
So then she ends up, first he goes to a friend's house. He takes all of his clothes out of their apartment, stores them in a locker. He stayed overnight at the home of Mrs. Jean Burke.
And he admits that he had choked Rachel, right? So we have that confirmation of this part of the facts. And then the next day, on July 26th,
So Rachel informs him that there's a warrant for his arrest. And then she ends up back at their apartment where he finally kills her and chokes her to death with a telephone cord.
and he telephones Mrs. Burke and says he had killed her that morning. And so on the 27th, the next day, Burke calls the police, says there's been a homicide. She gets to the apartment, and they found Rachel there on the floor dead. On August 1st, Barry is arrested and confesses to having killed her. What is he convicted of?
He's convicted of murder.
Convicted of murder, but argues on appeal there was at least some evidence sufficient to show that he committed the homicide in a state of uncontrollable rage caused by provocation, and thus he should have gotten an instruction, because there was sufficient evidence of provocation, so there should have been an instruction to the jury that at least gave the jury the opportunity to convict him only of voluntary manslaughter. Okay? So we have these facts. And what else does Barry introduce to try to support, bolster the claim of manslaughter?
So they have a physician and psychiatrist, Dr. Blinder, testify, and he says that it's a result of the cumulative series of events over these 2 weeks that provoked him. And at that time that he strangled her with the telephone cord, Barry was in a state of uncontrollable rage, completely under the sway of passion.
And that in fact she wanted him to provoke him into killing her, that she was suicidal, and that in effect he was the instrument of her suicide, that she, quote, finally achieved her unconscious desire and was strangled. So think about this for a minute. The defense's case is built here on the idea that she wanted it, that this was the outcome she wanted, and she got what she wanted. That's the testimony here. And Blinder, as you can see in the footnotes, on page 403, is a very controversial expert in a lot of these cases. And this is one of the cases that led to him being controversial. Okay? So what would you have thought when you read the earlier cases, and based on our discussion today, let's say we'd had the discussion today, and then you read Barry, what would you have thought would have been the California Supreme Court's answer to his attempt to argue an EED or heat of passion?
I would have thought they'd have said he had a cooling off period.
That what?
I would have thought they'd said he had a cooling off period.
That he had a cooling off period, because when did this course of behavior on her part begin?
It began 2 weeks before her death.
Not just 3 days, but 2 weeks. And he had the opportunity that a reasonable person would have had to cool off. Let's assume that we believe that her taunting, her saying to him, I had met this other guy, I've been sleeping with him, he's more of a man than you, all this awful stuff, we would agree, or at least a jury could conclude, was a sufficient to create the irresistible passion in the moment. But he didn't respond in the moment. He waited 2 weeks, right? And so you'd have the cooling off period, and therefore he loses. What does the California Supreme Court actually say?
They said that the long course of retaliatory conduct by Rachel actually would lead to this heat of passion moment, because it's the culmination of everything that she did.
And it says that, the culmination of a pattern, but the court also says, in terms of this cooling off period, what does the court say meant that the jury could have concluded? Mr. Smith?
Provocation over a 2-week period, the jury could conclude that those events could arouse passion, jealousy, pain, sexual rage in an ordinary man of average disposition.
But that doesn't get the cooling off period. What on top of the pattern does the court point out can overcome this?
Was it that verbal provocation might be sufficient?
Verbal provocation might be sufficient, but what does the court do about this immediacy problem?
It's possible for a defendant to be aroused by a series of events or
Yes, but what more? You're all giving me the series of events over the whole period, that it was sufficient. All true, but what does the court add to that? The court adds something to that about the final day.
Is it when she started screaming?
When was that?
When he was choking her?
And, well, I think it's before he started choking her. He testified that there was this final incident. Now, this is his testimony, but the jury could credit it, I guess you could say. And that screaming led him to strangle her with the telephone cord. And the question there is, let's assume for the moment that we're looking only at the final incident. And because anything else would be barred by the cooling off period. This whole series of 2 weeks. And if it's only the screaming at him, could screaming at somebody be said to be enough, if we're only looking at the final moment, enough to trigger passion and be sufficient that a reasonable person would lose control and kill?
They state that, like, they state back to, like, other case, saying that there's, like, no specific type of provocation. So I guess the screaming could account for that, and that verbal provocation may be sufficient.
And that is excellent, and that is why critics of EED say we have expanded it beyond any reasonable scope to allow too much to count as provocation. So Berry, on two different planes, on two different tracks, is an example of how if you wanted to criticize EED, or at least its application in this case, you could say this is a warning sign of how it can get too broad and allow the defense in too many situations. A, what constitutes provocation? Just screaming at somebody, if we're looking at the final incident, right? Is that enough to really be provocation, or should we say, no, we want to cabin it, limit it more? And then second, if we're not going to limit it to the final incident because we're looking for more provocation so that we're not expanding what counts as provocation too much, do we eliminate the cooling off period as a requirement, that if there is a time for cooling off, we're not going to allow the defense? So you can argue that on either way that somebody might defend this decision, it raises problems that the defense may have gone too far. There's arguments on the other side, but that's the way you could critique Berry, no matter how you read what was decisive for the California Supreme Court. I am confident that this case would not have gotten to a jury on EED in Kentucky. Confident. And that if the defendant tried to then say, I should have gotten my EED defense, I should have gotten a jury instruction, the conviction would have been affirmed. That the appellate courts would have shut that down. Would have said, nope, you we're not entitled to that instruction. Okay, we'll stop there. The only thing we have left to do on EED is at the beginning of class on Wednesday, I will give you 5 things under Kentucky law, 5 bullet points under Kentucky law about EED from the case law. And then we will start unintentional killings with Wolanski on Wednesday. Okay? See you then.
Professor Marks, are we staying like consistently one day behind, or should we read ahead a little bit?
No, we are going to